thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this year's Dig and Delve conference. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. So thanks to the organizing committee, and I really appreciate all the hospitality that's been extended to me while I've been here in Ottawa, my first time in Ottawa, so it's exciting for me to be here as well for that reason. To get things started this evening, I want to ask you a couple of questions about high school. Did any of you in high school have a teacher who drove you nuts? A teacher who you didn't care much for, maybe he or she didn't care much for you. Have you ever in high school had a teacher who was very impactful in your life, who positively influenced your life, who maybe opened up new vistas for you or helped you to see things in new ways, or maybe inspired you to new interests, or maybe even a career choice? Well, I had a teacher that was both. My high school English teacher, Catherine Hodges. From the first day of class when I was a senior in high school, Mrs. Hodges and I locked horns. We didn't care for each other much at all. In fact, I probably blame myself more than Mrs. Hodges because I was a real smart aleck when I was in high school. Haven't changed much over the years, but I was a real smart aleck in high school and probably had everything that was coming to me well deserved. But one of the things that Mrs. Hodges did that I'm forever grateful for is she inspired in me a love of Shakespeare. And to this day, I love to read Shakespeare. I love to see Shakespeare performed. In fact, a bucket list experience I had was a few years ago when I was able to go to the Globe Theatre in London and see Othello performed as well as The Tempest. And if I could ever get a chance to go back to London, the first thing I'm going to do is get tickets to the Globe Theatre. One of my favorite Shakespearean plays would be Hamlet. And I just find Hamlet fascinating. And one of my favorite passages in Hamlet is a scene where Hamlet is essentially agonizing over the fact that he is unable to act out against the person who killed his father. He's unable to carry out vengeance to address the issue of his father's murder. And so he asks a question that's rather profound that I think really sets the stage for what we're talking about this weekend at Dig and Delve, where Hamlet says this: "What is a man if his chief good and the market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast no more. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fasten us unused." Now think about it for a minute. What Hamlet is doing is he's setting up essentially the dilemma that we're confronted with today. Namely, are human beings merely animals where our chief goal ultimately is to satisfy our fleshly desires? That is, are we just to sleep and feed? Or is there something more to human beings? We have, again, this incredible capacity to anticipate the future and to remember the past. We have this godlike capability, and because we have that, does that mean that we have an ultimate purpose and an ultimate destiny? And again, that's the question that's on the table this weekend. That's the question I'm going to begin to address tonight from a scientific perspective. Now, I would argue that the way we think about human origins is deeply intertwined with the question, what is a human being? And I think that what we think about our origin, again, has tremendous amount of consequences in terms of how we view ourselves as human beings. And let me illustrate this by talking about, for a few minutes, the prevailing view in the scientific community with regard to the question of human origins, and that's an evolutionary perspective, where the argument is that human beings evolved over the span of 6 to 7 million years, beginning with some kind of ape-like creature that over, again, that window of time progressed through a series of transitional forms, ultimately culminating in the emergence of modern humans. Intermediates like Neanderthals and Homo habilis and Homo erectus. And this particular perspective is not only a view that, again, is part of the scientific construct in contemporary science. This view has permeated our culture and our world, and such that many people would argue that human beings are the product of evolution. Now, you might ask yourself, what difference does that make? I think it makes all the difference in the world. And to illustrate this, I want to show you what I think to be an incredible diagram. This is an evolutionary tree of life showing every major group of organism that has ever existed to our knowledge on the surface of the earth over the last 3.8 billion years. This is, again, viewing life in from an evolutionary context. And you can see here at the very, very tip of the tree an incredibly inconsequential twig that essentially is human beings. That is, if you view human beings as the product of evolution, that means everything about humanity is ultimately the outworking of mechanistic process, including our intellectual capability. And that we are just one of countless number of species on the surface of the planet. And given the nature of the evolutionary mechanism, which is an unguided, historically contingent process where designs in biology are co-opted and transformed through the process of selection to produce new designs, through that process of quote-unquote creation, human beings may never have ever appeared on the surface of the earth. We just are a happy accident of an evolutionary history. Rewind the tape of life and replay it, as Stephen Jay Gould said, and the outcome would be very different. Human beings may never have emerged. There is no purpose, there is no destiny, there is no ultimate meaning to human life if you take an evolutionary perspective. This is what Stephen Jay Gould says in his book, The Wonderful Life. This means, and we must face the implication squarely, that the origin of Homo sapiens as a tiny twig on an improbable branch of a contingent limb on a fortunate tree lies well below the boundary. In Darwin's scheme, we are a detail, not a purpose or an embodiment of the whole, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. This is the evolutionary perspective for human origins, and the consequences, I think, are rather devastating. If you have that perspective on human beings, if that's how you view your ultimate origin, then what kind of decisions are you going to make regarding your life? What kind of decisions are you going to make in terms of the way you engage other people and how you value other people? What kind of decisions are we going to make as a society if this is the particular view we have of humanity? And I would submit to you that many of the social ills that are confronting the Western world today are ultimately, I think, traceable back to the implications of an evolutionary view of human origins. Now, there are some Christians who are trying to redeem the evolutionary process by arguing maybe God used evolution as the means to create. This is called theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism. And this is an interesting idea. There's nothing wrong with this idea at face value, but for me, I have a very difficult time squaring this mechanism of creation where God would employ evolution as a means to create with what the scripture teaches. If you take a view that human beings are the product of an evolutionary history, then you cannot have a historical Adam and Eve in the traditional biblical sense. Either Adam and Eve are mythical constructs or they're representatives of a group of the first human beings, but they cannot be the primordial pair from which all humanity emanates. You cannot have that in an evolutionary creationist context. And I find that very difficult to square that idea with what the biblical text teaches. Moreover, if you raise questions about the historicity of Adam and Eve and raise questions about whether or not they were the first human beings, again, that gave rise to all humanity, it raises all kinds of issues that undermine fundamentally, I think, the Christian faith. Issues related to biblical inerrancy, questions about what do we mean when we talk about the image of God, Questions about the fall, questions about original sin, questions about the atonement even are tied into whether or not Adam and Eve are historical. And again, the first human beings that gave rise to all humanity. And so for that reason, I find it very difficult to simply take this idea of human evolution and co-opt it into a Christian worldview perspective. At the end of the day, I think if you take Scripture seriously, it teaches that there was a historical Adam and Eve that were the first human beings that, again, were created in God's image and that gave rise to all humanity. This is, I think, what the Bible is clearly teaching. And so the question on the table this evening is, how do we square this idea with the scientific data that is emerging from anthropology regarding the origin of humanity? Is there a way to square this data, to harmonize this perspective of human origins with the scientific data? And so that's what we're going to be doing in the remaining time that we have, where I'm going to be taking a look at a scientific case for a traditional biblical view of human origins, focusing primarily on work in genetics. And what I'm going to focus on for the next several minutes is an area known as molecular anthropology. And this is a relatively new area in anthropology where the study of humanity's origin focuses on the genetic variability of people around the world. And from the genetic variability, it's possible to gain insight into the origin of humanity. And DNA is the molecule that harbors genetic information. And so genetic variability is essentially due to variations in the structure of DNA. And by looking at the nature of those variations and the extent of those variations, it's possible to gain understanding about when humanity originates, about the general location of humanity's origin. We can get information about the original population sizes and the pattern in the spread of humanity. So this is a very powerful tool that gives us very important insight, again, into the origin of humanity. And what I'm going to talk about are results that have come from studies in molecular anthropology. Most of this work was done from within the context of the evolutionary paradigm. Most of this data in the scientific literature is interpreted within the context, again, of the evolutionary framework. What I'm going to try to do is tease away the data from the evolutionary perspective, and I'm going to make an argument that when we view this data from a biblical perspective, it provides provocative evidence that suggests that there really was a historical Adam and Eve as Scripture teaches. Now, there have been hundreds of studies that have been done under the umbrella of molecular anthropology. And researchers have used a variety of different genetic markers to try to gain insight into the origin of humanity. And collectively, these studies consistently indicate that humanity had a single origin, not multiple origins in different parts of the world, but rather a single origin in a single location, namely East Africa, that humanity's origin is somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago, and that humanity emanated from a small population. The data also indicates that when you utilize these different genetic markers, you can trace humanity's origin back to single ancestral sequences for these genetic markers. And of particular interest are two genetic markers. One of them is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is a circular piece of DNA found in organelles in cells called mitochondria. These are the powerhouses of the cell. And it turns out that mitochondrial DNA has a very clean pattern of inheritance. It's from mother to child. So my daughters don't have my mitochondrial DNA, they have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. And when our kids were little and they would act up, I would remind my wife that they had her mitochondrial DNA. I had nothing to do with their bad behavior. But it also is not only a clean pattern of inheritance, it doesn't undergo something called recombination, which means it gives you a very clear and clean picture of the origin of humanity's maternal lineage. And it turns out that every person on the planet can trace an origin back to a single ancestral sequence of mitochondrial DNA that many researchers believe corresponds to a single female individual, interestingly enough. With Y chromosomal DNA, this is DNA that is inherited from father to son, so it gives us a perspective on the paternal lineage. There's a region of the Y chromosome that doesn't undergo recombination. It's cleverly named the non-recombining region of the Y. And this, again, also gives us a very similar picture to the mitochondrial DNA data. It shows that every man on the planet can trace an origin back to a single ancestral sequence of Y chromosomal DNA that is, again, thought to correspond to a single male individual. And in fact, in the scientific literature, these ancestral sequences are referred to as mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, respectively, which is extremely provocative. Because again, it's beginning to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's some credibility to this biblical account of human origins from a scientific perspective. You can also trace the migration of humanity around the world as well, using both Y chromosomal DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And this is just a representative type of mitochondrial DNA migration map that you would produce. Again, looking at variation in mitochondrial DNA from people around the world. And it turns out that humanity's migration begins somewhere at or near the Middle East and then fans outward, where the first migration was along the southeastern coast of Asia into Australia, into Central Asia, and then from Central Asia into Europe, and then ultimately into the Americas. So we have a pretty good understanding of how humanity began to migrate around the world, and I would submit to you that this migration pattern is, again, something that seems to resonate with what you'd expect to see given the account of humanity's spread around the world in Genesis 10. So the question on the table then is it possible to square this data with the biblical account of human origins? Because again, the data seems rather provocative, that humanity can trace an origin back to arguably a single male and female individual, again with respect to Y chromosomal DNA and mitochondrial DNA. The migration patterns, again, are patterns that broadly seem to be consistent with the biblical account of, again, the spread of humanity around the world. Well, in spite of the overall general correspondence with the biblical text and the scientific data, there's still some questions about the timing of humanity's origin, the location of humanity's origin. If you are a Christian here tonight, those are probably two questions that immediately come to your mind when you look at that data, because doesn't there seem to be conflict between the biblical account and the scientific data in terms of the timing and the location of humanity's origin? And then there's also questions, if you're more scientifically oriented, about population sizes, because people would argue that the first human populations from an evolutionary standpoint would have been several thousand individuals, not a primordial pair. And so what I want to do in the next several minutes is kind of step through some of these questions, and I hope to show you that as we start thinking about these three outstanding questions in some detail, we're going to see that what appears to be a conflict or a potential conflict actually turns into harmony. So let's take a look at the timing of humanity's origin. Now, many people would argue that the biblical text teaches that humanity originated about 6,000 years ago. And of course, you have the scientific data saying humanity's origin is somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago. So how do you make sense of that? Well, the first thing that we need to point out is that the techniques that are used from genetic variability to estimate the timing of humanity's origin, these are called molecular clock studies, are not very precise. These are crudely accurate methods, but they're horribly imprecise methods, where you've got very large degrees of uncertainty. So the best way to think about these results from molecular anthropology is that these are crude estimates for the timing of humanity's origin. They're not high precision constants of physics. Okay, and one researcher who's worked in this area said that you're looking at telling time with the sundial in molecular clock studies, not a high precision watch. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is the scientific data is giving us just crude estimates. But also from a biblical standpoint, I would contend that the Bible is actually silent as to when Adam and Eve were created. Now, what people do to arrive at a date of 6,000 years for the origin of humanity is to use the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. Genesis 5 is the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and in Genesis 11, it's from Noah to Abraham. So the idea here is that we know when Abraham lived, and you know how old the patriarchs were when they gave birth to their sons, and how old their sons were when they gave birth to sons. And so you start doing some arithmetic, and you wind up with a date for humanity's creation at about 6,000 years ago. The problem with that is that, number one, the genealogies were never intended to be used that way. I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm a biochemist, but I've read extensively on commentators who are experts in the Old Testament and experts in the Genesis creation accounts. And to a T, they will tell you, the best scholarship will tell you, that these genealogies are theological constructs. They're not meant to be time-keeping devices. That there are gaps in the genealogies. There are names that are omitted, which is a common practice in biblical genealogies. The genealogies are typically written according to a pattern. And in Genesis 5 and 11, it is essentially 10 names where the final son gives birth, or the final member of the genealogy gives birth to 3 sons. So there's a pattern there, and so in order to conform to that pattern, there are names that are omitted. The patriarchs that are mentioned are just simply key patriarchs in the lineage from Adam to Noah and Noah to Abraham that, again, are included for theological reasons. There's ambiguity in the original Hebrew. The word that's translated as son can mean descendant. The word that's translated as begot can mean to give rise to a lineage. Old Testament scholar K.A. Kitchen basically says the way to read the genealogies is that Patriarch X gave rise to a lineage that included at some point Patriarch Y, and at some point in time Patriarch Y gave rise to a lineage that included Patriarch Z. That's the way to read the genealogies. And in fact, the genealogies again have theological significance. Again, they're not meant to be time-keeping constructs. And there is an Old Testament scholar named Dan Dyke who has written some articles for our website at reasons.org dealing with the issue of the genealogies. And what Dan Dyke and one of his collaborators, Hugh Henry, who's a physicist, write is that the genealogy in Genesis 5 is very interesting in that it's the only genealogy in Scripture that makes mention of the fact that the patriarchs died. After it lists the members of in the genealogy, for each one it says, and they died. And what Dan Dyke and Hugh Henry argue is that the purpose of the genealogy in Genesis 5, or at least one purpose, is to communicate that God keeps his promises. Because we see in the Genesis 2 creation account that God says to Adam, from the day, or that when you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on that day you surely will die. And so when you look at the genealogy in Genesis 5, after it mentions Adam, there's a parenthetical statement reminding us that Adam was made in God's image, the implication being that the image of God is going to be propagated to all of his descendants. And then it says Adam died, and Seth died, and on and on and on, indicating that God too is keeping his promise that death is essentially propagated along with the image of God to all of Adam's descendants. If you go to the genealogy in Genesis 11, you see again something very similar, where again it's communicating that God keeps his promises. In Genesis 6, we see that God is frustrated with humanity, and he shortens human life expectancy to no more than 120 years. And what do you see in Genesis 11? The life expectancy becomes progressively shorter and shorter. These are significant theological points that are being communicated in the genealogies. So the point here is that I don't believe that Scripture is telling us when Adam and Eve were created. And the fact that Scripture is silent on this issue means that there's no conflict between a biblical time frame for the creation of Adam and Eve and the scientific date at somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years ago. Now, what about the location of humanity's origin? Doesn't the Bible teach that humanity was created in the Garden of Eden? And isn't that in Mesopotamia? Well, again, there's uncertainty in the scientific data. We don't know the precise location of humanity's origin. East Africa is an approximate location for humanity's origin, and I'm not going to get into the details tonight as to why that's the case. But it's also interesting to note that a location of humanity's origin in East Africa is near Mesopotamia. So it's not this ridiculous, outlandish location. It's actually an approximate location to Mesopotamia. Moreover, we don't know from the biblical text the precise location of the Garden of Eden. And I'm not going to get into the details just because of for the sake of time, but the best scholarship seems to place the Garden of Eden at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, and there are some commentators who believe that the Garden of Eden actually extended into Ethiopia because it makes mention in Genesis 2 of the land of Cush, which is Ethiopia in the Old Testament. And so it's provocative that, again, the location of humanity's origin is very close to where we think the Garden of Eden would have been. Now, the last point is a little bit technical, but this is one of the most significant challenges in my mind to correlating the data from molecular anthropology to the biblical account of human origins, and it has to do with the population size of the very first humans. Was it a primordial pair, or were there several thousand individuals? Many people who are evolutionary biologists would argue that the data from molecular anthropology does not indicate there were two individuals, but again, several thousand individuals. And so what I'd like to do is spend some time now essentially addressing this question. In some places, this will get a little bit technical for some of you, and I apologize for that. Some of you, I won't be technical enough. That's how it usually goes in an audience like this. But what I encourage you to do is that if you feel like this is a little bit too technical and going over your head, just focus on the big picture concepts to the best of your ability, okay? So, in order to appreciate why evolutionary biologists challenge the idea that humanity came from a primordial pair, in spite of this idea that there's a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosome Adam, we need to understand how evolutionary biologists interpret this data from molecular anthropology. And they basically argue that this data is in support of something known as the out of Africa model, which basically said humanity has a recent singular origin in East Africa, and that humanity began as a relatively small population size, and that initial human population essentially is the result of what's known as a genetic bottleneck, where there was a larger population of hominins that were immediate evolutionary ancestors of modern humans. That population underwent a catastrophic collapse, and as a result, that population went through a genetic bottleneck, and that genetic bottleneck in effect created or produced, in an evolutionary sense, modern humans. And that as modern humans began to recover from this near extinction, they began to increase in population size and began to expand throughout the world. And so this is what's, again, known as the out of Africa model from an evolutionary context. And they would argue that again, there was a mitochondrial Eve, there was a Y chromosome Adam. They very well could have been, again, an actual male and female individual, but they would argue that there are many Eves and that there are many Adams, and that the Eve that we all can trace her origin back to was one lucky mother whose mitochondrial DNA survived to contemporary times, and that all the other lineages died out. And the same thing would be true with Y chromosome Adam. He was the one lucky father. And so this is how evolutionary biologists interpret this data. So the question is this a valid way to view the data from molecular anthropology? And even though that this is, again, kind of a mainstream scientific interpretation of the data from molecular anthropology, I'm not convinced that it's actually a valid interpretation of the data for a number of reasons. First of all, has to do with the way in which people view the evolutionary process. From an evolutionary standpoint, and this is something that many people are confused by, but from an evolutionary standpoint, individuals don't evolve. Populations evolve. Evolution is a population level phenomena. So that if you're going to argue that human beings evolved, then by definition there had to be a population. There had to be many Eves, there had to be many Adams. There's no other way around this. To say that there was a primordial pair from an evolutionary context would be considered to be an absurdity in light of the evolutionary framework. So by definition, if you say humanity evolved, you're dealing with a population. This is something that philosophers of science would call a theory-laden idea or a theory-laden fact, where the fact itself is intertwined with the very theory. So even if there was actually a primordial pair from which all humanity emanated, as soon as you view human origins from an evolutionary standpoint, you have to argue there was a population. So that's one reason why evolutionary biologists insist that there was a population, that there were many Eves and there were many Adams. Another reason has to do with these two equations. Now these equations are something that you would see in a population genetics textbook. And these equations essentially relate genetic variability to population size and mutation rate, where H is genetic variability, N sub E is population size, and U is mutation rate. And so if you rearrange those equations using a little bit of algebra, you can actually calculate population size if you know the genetic variability and the mutation rate. And so evolutionary biologists will use these equations, and they will argue that the population size that you calculate from the genetic variability of humanity is on the order of several thousand, not two individuals. Now the problem here is that these equations are well and good, but they're highly simplified, highly idealized equations that are trying to model a very complex phenomena. And because of that, you cannot view the results from these kind of calculations as having, again, any kind of precision or even accuracy. These are crude estimates at best. So for example, in Who Was Adam, I talk about two studies done by the same research group looking at the same genetic markers. The only difference in these two studies were the people groups that they were sampling DNA from. And in one study, they estimate the population size at 500. Another study, they estimated at 2,000. And so again, you can see the type of uncertainty that exists in this data. In effect, when you get results like that, those results are indistinguishable statistically from a population of two. A population of a few thousand is indistinguishable from a population size of two with that kind of uncertainty in the data. Now, another concern that I have is that nobody has validated the methods used to calculate population sizes. Now what do I mean by that? Well, anytime you develop a scientific method, you have to validate it. You have to show that that method produces reliable results. How do you do that? By basically taking a system where you know what the answer is and applying that method to that system. And if you get the answer that you should get, then you have confidence that the method works. And to my knowledge, nobody has actually done any validation work on these methods. I've searched through the scientific literature and I can find no method validation on these population size calculations. In fact, if you look at studies in conservation biology, you actually begin to have questions as to whether or not these methods are valid whatsoever. Conservation biology is really interesting because this is an area where people are interested in the relationship between genetic variability and population sizes, right? And so there's a couple of studies that are worth noting. One of them has to do with Mouflon sheep. In the 1950s, researchers took two sheep from a zoo in Paris, a male and a female sheep, and they put them on an island off the southern tip of South America. And that breeding pair produced a population that's on that island today. And over time, researchers have monitored that population. And a few years ago, they sampled the genetic variability of the sheep on that island. And it turns out that the variability was much greater than they would have expected, given, again, these population size numbers that people are generating. Meaning that the methods weren't reliable. That if you actually took the genetic variability of the sheep on the island today and calculated what the original population size was, you get a larger size than two individuals. Again, the methods aren't reliable. And you see a similar kind of problem in a study with Przewalski's horses, which were these horses in Siberia that virtually went to almost to extinction. At one time, there were 12 individuals in the population. Since then, the Przewalski's horses have recovered, but again, their genetic variability is greater than these equations would predict for population size. So again, it just simply is showing that these methods don't appear to be valid, and so we shouldn't get worked up about the results that come to us from these population size estimates. And then finally, there have been people that even question whether or not these equations are valid equations whatsoever. This goes to the very heart of some key ideas that are part of population genetics. One researcher named Hans Ahlgren, in a paper published in the Journal of Biology, said this: analysis of mitochondrial DNA have challenged the concept that genetic diversity within populations is governed by effective population size and mutation rate. The variation in the rate of mutation rather than in population size is the main explanation for variations in mitochondrial DNA diversity observed among bird species, and this is true possibly as well for mammals. So the whole point here is that there are researchers that are raising questions as to whether or not these equations are valid. So the point being this is that even though this is the claim from evolutionary biologists is that there was a population of several thousand individuals, not a primordial pair, the actual science that supports that conclusion is suspect. And given the fact that everybody on the planet can trace an origin back to a single female individual, and every man can trace an origin back to a single male individual, to me is sufficient reason to think that there's scientific support for the biblical account of human origins. These population size estimates don't impress me whatsoever. And so I would say that it's just as legitimate to look at the data as indicating that we all came from a single mother, not a lucky mother, but a single mother. Now, in the time that I have remaining, I want to talk about a couple of other genetic issues that relate to, again, to the question of human origins. And one of them has to do with the genetic similarity between humans and chimps. Many people would argue that the genetic similarity between humans and chimps represents the most compelling evidence that human beings must have had an evolutionary history. How many of you are familiar with those claims, right? Almost everybody has heard this. This has become kind of iconic in our culture today, that genetic similarity, where people argue that not only is the similarity in terms of raw percentage pretty extreme between humans and chimps, somewhere between 95 to 98% genetic similarity, we also have shared DNA sequences as well, and you can actually create these types of evolutionary trees by looking at the genetic similarities and differences between humans and the great apes. And so people argue that this data provides compelling evidence, again, for common descent. But I would actually argue that this is essentially one way to look at the data, that this data is being viewed from an evolutionary framework, that you could actually view the data from a biblical framework or from a creation model framework more appropriately, and make sense of this data just as easily as you can make sense of it from an evolutionary standpoint. In fact, I would even argue that the biblical text seems to anticipate a high degree of genetic similarity between humans and the great apes. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at Genesis 2:7. It describes the creation of Adam from the dust of the earth, and then God breathes the breath of life into Adam. So Adam is created from the dust of the earth, and then God animates Adam with the divine breath. Genesis 2:19 talks about the birds and the beasts being created from the dust of the earth as well. Interestingly enough, they don't receive the divine breath. I think that was an intentional omission. But the implications of this are that basically human beings and the other creatures are made out of the same stuff. We're made out of the same stuff using the same design templates. So of course we're going to display similar anatomical, physiological, biochemical, and genetic similarities with other creatures. And so you could look at that similarity as reflecting common design as opposed to common descent. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the history of thought in biology, prior to Darwin, there was an idea for, again, that was part of the theoretical construct of biology that accounted for biological similarities among organisms as reflecting essentially shared design, not shared descent. And this idea was the product of the mind of Sir Richard Owen. Richard Owen is shown here on the left, and we have Darwin, of course, on the right. Sir Richard Owen was a predecessor of Darwin, and many people would argue that he was one of the founders of modern-day biology. He's the father of comparative anatomy. In Owen's day, he was such a prominent biologist in the United Kingdom that people spoke of him in the same context as they would speak of Isaac Newton. He was that prominent of a biologist. And Owen looked at shared features that organisms possess, which are called homologous features, and argued that these homologous features reflect the outworkings of an archetypical design that existed in the mind of a creator that was then functionally manifested in the created order. And so he saw those shared features, or those homologous features, as evidence for common design, not common descent. Darwin later on comes along and takes the concept of the archetype and co-opts it and replaces the archetype with a hypothetical shared ancestor. But this is what Richard Owen says about the archetype. It is that ideal, original, or fundamental pattern on which a natural group of animals or system of organs has been constructed into modifications which the various forms of such animals or organs may be referred. And then Owen goes on to say that an archetype points to a deep and pregnant principle, some archetypical exemplar on which it has pleased the Creator to frame certain of his living creatures. And so the idea here is that this idea that Owen is espousing in theoretical terms is essentially an idea that echoes or is parallel to what we could infer from the biblical account, that these shared genetic features reflect common design, not common descent. And then one final point that I want to make, and that has to do with something called junk DNA. And I'm going to be talking more about this tomorrow in one of the sessions. But many people would argue that it's not just simply the shared genetic features that provide evidence for common descent. It's the fact that many of these shared genetic features consist of what's called junk DNA or non-functional DNA. And so the argument goes that it makes no sense for a creator to introduce garbage into the genomes of organisms, and that junk DNA would show up as identical sequences in corresponding regions of the genomes. And so what people argue is that the only way to make sense of that is that if there was an evolutionary history where those junk DNA sequences arose in the shared ancestor and persisted in the genomes of organisms that diverged from that shared ancestor through different evolutionary lineages. But this argument is only valid if that junk DNA is not functional. And one of the things that we have learned over the last 10 years or so is that virtually every class of junk DNA now has had function ascribed to it. And as a result of that, we don't need to think about junk DNA as reflecting, again, common descent. It could be very well understood as evidence for common design. But the idea that junk DNA sequences have function reached kind of a pinnacle in the fall of 2011 when the results of the Encode project were published. This is a project that was designed to identify all the different functional elements in the human genome. And it turns out that these researchers demonstrated that at minimum 80% of the human genome turns out to consist of functional DNA. Prior to these results, people thought that about 2 to 3% of the human genome consisted of functional sequences. The rest was junk. We now know that the human genome is essentially largely functional. In fact, there are people that are suspecting that most of the human genome consists of functional DNA. And so this insight blows the whole junk DNA argument for common descent and for human evolution completely out of the water. And it makes it possible now to view genomes as the product of a creator's handiwork. Eric Green, who was the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute at the time that the Encode project was published, said this: during the early debates about the Human Genome Project, researchers had predicted that only a few % of the human genome sequence encoded proteins, the workhorses of the cell. The rest was junk. We now know that this conclusion was wrong. Encode has revealed that most of the human genome is involved in the complex molecular choreography required for converting genetic information into living cells and tissues. So the point that I've been trying to make this evening is this: that when it comes to the traditional biblical understanding of human origins, namely the idea that there was an Adam and an Eve that were the first human beings created in God's image that gave rise to all humanity, that this idea has scientific merit and scientific credibility. That the data that is used to argue for human evolution, if you tease that data away from the evolutionary framework and just look at the data as it is, or view that data from a creation model perspective, you see that data harmonizes in a remarkable way with the biblical account of human origins. And this is significant because it means that this idea, which is, I think, so critical to for us to be able to justify viewing human life as having intrinsic worth and dignity, has again scientific merit. And that this idea that the traditional biblical understanding of human origins, I would even argue, is the foundation for the very gospel itself. And so, as Christians, we don't need to be apologetic about the human origins account in Scripture. We don't need to think of Adam and Eve as being mythical or as being representatives. We can embrace this traditional biblical view and at the same time harmonize that view with the advances in science that are dealing with the question of human origins. Tomorrow morning, I'll talk about the scientific case that we can make for human exceptionalism and the idea that human beings are made in God's image. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and stop at this point, and I'll be happy to take questions in the remaining time that we have.